Florida was never supposed to fail. With its endless sunshine, world-famous beaches, and booming tourism industry, it was the state that seemed immune to collapse. But in 2025, something unimaginable happened. Florida's leaders managed to destroy their own $37 billion tourism empire, not through hurricanes, not through pandemics, but through politics. This wasn't an accident. It was a man-made economic disaster engineered in the halls of Tallahassee by politicians who thought they were saving money while quietly setting fire to the state's most important industry. For decades, Florida's economy ran on tourism. Every winter, millions of Canadians poured billions of dollars into local restaurants, hotels, and real estate markets. They were more than visitors. They were the lifeblood of entire towns from Fort Lauderdale to Naples, spending an average of $33,000 per household every season. But arrogance and ideology drove them away. It began with political insults that spiraled into policy decisions so reckless they wiped out billions in a single year. International travel plummeted, Canadian flights were slashed, and Florida's beaches, once packed with snowbirds, grew eerily quiet. Then came the moment that sealed the state's fate. In early 2025, Florida's lawmakers moved to eliminate all 62 tourist development councils, the organizations responsible for promoting the state worldwide. These councils weren't bureaucratic fluff. They were Florida's marketing engine, funded by hotel taxes to attract events, restore beaches, and keep tourists coming back. Eliminating them meant removing the one system designed to sustain the economy that kept Florida alive. Analysts warned of a $37 billion hit to the economy, along with $22.5 billion in lost wages for workers. But the politicians pushed ahead anyway, promising residents a $60 property tax break in exchange for the collapse of their own tourism machine. It was like watching someone burn down their house to save on electricity. Within months, the fallout was impossible to hide. Hotel bookings crashed, small businesses went dark, and for sale signs multiplied across Clearwater, Fort Myers, and Boca Raton. The very people who once made Florida thrive were now walking away, their loyalty replaced by disbelief. As one business owner said, "We didn't lose our customers, they were driven out." What happened next would prove that Florida's so-called free state had become trapped by its own politics. This is the story of how arrogance, short-term thinking, and a war on common sense turned the Sunshine State into the cautionary tale of modern America. To understand how Florida's $37 billion disaster began, you have to understand what made the state's economy unstoppable in the first place. For decades, tourism wasn't just an industry, it was the heartbeat of Florida's economy, a machine that powered more than 2.1 million jobs and generated over $150 billion every year. In 2024, the state welcomed 142.9 million visitors, setting yet another record. Florida didn't have to sell itself, it was already the world's playground. But what its politicians forgot is that success in tourism isn't automatic. It's earned through relationships, consistency, and trust. Those relationships were with Canadians, the state's most loyal and valuable visitors. They weren't vacationers, they were investors, homeowners, and community members. Each winter, they filled condos, restaurants, and small-town shops across Naples, Fort Lauderdale, and Clearwater, spending an average of $33,000 per household and keeping the economy alive during off-season months. But that trust was shattered by politics. It started at the top. President Donald Trump mocked Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, calling Canada the 51st state, and slapped heavy tariffs on Canadian goods. For millions of Canadians, the insult wasn't just diplomatic, it was personal. And when they looked south, they saw Florida as part of that hostility. Then came Governor Ron DeSantis, who made things worse. Instead of repairing the rift, he told reporters that foreign tourists like Canadians and Brazilians should help subsidize Floridians' taxes, bragging that he wouldn't give them tax breaks. Those remarks spread quickly across Canadian media, painting Florida as unwelcoming and arrogant. Overnight, the snowbird migration that had lasted generations began to slow. Canadians canceled long-term rentals, postponed flights, and told friends to spend their winters elsewhere. The numbers reflected the damage. Congressman Jared Moskowitz reported an 80% drop in Canadian tourists in some parts of the state. In Hollywood, Florida hotel owner Richard Clavette said his Canadian guests fell by 50% compared to the previous year. These weren't isolated figures, they were symptoms of a collapse in trust. And while Canadian visitors pulled back, Florida's leaders made a catastrophic decision that turned a crisis into an outright implosion. In early 2025, the Florida House of Representatives proposed eliminating all 62 tourist development councils, known as TDCs, the backbone of Florida's global marketing machine. Funded by hotel and tourism taxes, these councils used nearly $2 billion annually to advertise Florida attract events, restore beaches, and support local tourism economies. In other words, they were the state's sales team. Without them, Florida was flying blind in the most competitive travel market on Earth. Experts sounded the alarm immediately. Florida Politics published a detailed analysis, warning that dismantling the TDC system would wipe out $37 billion in annual economic output and destroy $22.5 billion in wages. The executive director of Destinations Florida, Robert Scrobb, called the move an act of economic sabotage. He warned lawmakers that cutting marketing budgets would gamble with the livelihoods of millions of Floridians. But state politicians brushed it off as fiscal responsibility. They told voters it would save the average household about $60 a year in property taxes. That's right, $60 in exchange for a $37 billion economic meltdown. To put it simply, Florida's leaders forgot the first rule of business: you don't stop marketing when you're successful. You double down to stay there. Yet that's exactly what they did. They assumed Florida's reputation would sell itself forever. They believed tourists would keep coming no matter how badly they were treated or how little effort the state put into promoting itself. It was a fatal mistake born of arrogance, a belief that the Sunshine State could coast on its past glory while ignoring the reality of a changing world. What they didn't understand was that tourism is not a guarantee. It's a competition, and by abandoning the very tools that made them a global destination, Florida's politicians opened the door for rivals like Mexico, the Caribbean, and Southern Europe to take everything they had built. By the middle of 2025, the damage was no longer theoretical, it was visible everywhere, along the once bustling coastlines of Fort Myers, Clearwater, and Naples. For sale signs began to outnumber tourists. Hotel parking lots stood half empty, souvenir shops shuttered, and restaurant owners quietly laid off staff they'd employed for decades. The numbers confirmed what locals already knew: Florida's tourism machine had stalled. Canadian arrivals dropped 25.2% year over year, and visits by car fell another 34%, according to Forbes. But this wasn't just about Canada anymore. It was about how quickly one political misstep could spread into a full-blown economic contagion. Without their tourist development councils, Florida's cities lost their voice in the global tourism market. There were no ad campaigns, no trade missions, no coordinated effort to remind the world why Florida mattered. The $2 billion once spent annually on marketing events and beach restoration vanished overnight, replaced by silence. And in tourism, silence is death. Small business owners saw the collapse happen in real time. Annie Holcomb, a business development executive in Panama City, called the elimination of the council's economic suicide. You don't stop marketing when you're on top, she warned, because the moment you do, someone else takes your place. She was right. As Florida went dark, competitors pounced. Mexico ramped up advertising in Toronto. Portugal launched travel incentives, and the Caribbean flooded social media with campaigns aimed directly at Canadian snowbirds. It worked. Canadians weren't just avoiding Florida, they were replacing it. Resorts in Cancun and Lisbon reported record bookings from longtime Florida visitors looking for somewhere that still feels welcoming. Meanwhile, Governor Ron DeSantis and his administration insisted everything was fine. At the 2025 Florida Governor's Conference on Tourism, he bragged that the state still welcomed 34.4 million visitors that quarter. But hidden behind that number was the truth. Only 640,000 here were Canadians, down more than 20% from the previous year. Brian Griffin, the new CEO of Visit Florida, tried to spin it by saying Brazilian tourism was up. But everyone in the industry knew the math didn't add up. Brazilians stay a week, Canadians stay 5 months. A 1 week vacationer doesn't buy property, pay property taxes, or keep grocery stores and local workers employed year round. Replacing snowbirds with short term tourists is like replacing a paycheck with a tip. The result was devastating. In Hollywood, beach hotel owner Richard Clavette watched as his reservations plunged 50%. In Fort Myers, beach businesses that had survived Hurricane Ian finally gave up, unable to survive the financial storm created by their own state government. Clearwater's downtown, once alive with winter visitors, now looked like an off-season ghost town. Even the real estate market, long considered untouchable, began to freeze. Mortgage locks for second homes fell 25% year over year, and international property searches for Florida plummeted across Canadian markets. The collapse rippled beyond the coastlines. Construction companies saw contracts evaporate as developers paused new projects. Local governments started to feel the financial pinch, with property tax revenues shrinking and public budgets tightening. And the irony was impossible to ignore. Florida's politicians had promised to save taxpayers money, but now those same taxpayers were watching their communities crumble. They cut $2 billion from marketing to save $60 a year in property taxes, one business owner said bitterly. Now, I can't even make rent. Even more tragic was the emotional fallout. For decades, Florida's identity had been built on the promise of warmth, not just weather, but welcome. It was the state where anyone could belong, where visitors became neighbors and strangers became friends. That image has been shattered. Florida doesn't feel friendly anymore, said one former snowbird from Ottawa. It feels hostile. The Sunshine State had turned cold. By late 2025, the data painted a brutal picture. Tourism employment fell sharply, international arrivals were at their lowest levels in years, and local economies that depended on winter migration were hollowing out. The empire Florida built on tourism wasn't toppled by outside forces. It collapsed under the weight of its own politics. And as the state's leaders continued to deny the crisis, the rest of the world quietly moved on. The ripple effects of Florida's $37 billion disaster stretch far beyond the beaches and hotels. When a state that depends on tourism drives away its most loyal visitors, the impact hits everything from the smallest mom-and-pop diners to the foundations of local government. In 2025, thousands of Floridians began to realize that what politicians dismissed as budget reform was actually dismantling the ecosystem that kept their communities alive. Property tax revenues started shrinking as Canadian homeowners sold their condos and left, leaving empty units and declining neighborhood values. Those taxes had funded schools, police departments, and fire stations, the backbone of local life. City councils from Boca Raton to Fort Myers began facing budget shortfalls they'd never experienced before. When the snowbirds go, everything slows down, said a local restaurant owner in Naples. It's not just business, it's the entire town that stops moving. The collapse of the tourist development councils meant cities lost their ability to compete for events, conventions, and international exposure. Florida used to host global conferences, sports tournaments, and massive corporate gatherings, all of which pumped millions into local economies. But without funding for marketing and event outreach, those opportunities vanished overnight. We used to win those bids because we had the infrastructure and the promotion, said Annie Holcomb, a tourism executive from Panama City. Now those events are going to Texas, California, and Mexico. What once made Florida unstoppable, its ability to sell itself to the world, had been traded away for political talking points. On the ground, the human cost became clearer each month. Hospitality workers saw their hours cut as hotels downsized operations. Real estate agents couldn't find buyers. Construction crews were idled as planned developments froze. The trickle-down effect was brutal. Fewer tourists meant fewer jobs meant less spending, and less spending meant more closures. By late 2025, parts of the Gulf Coast were seeing unemployment rise faster than after Hurricane Ian. We survived the storm, said a small business owner in Fort Myers Beach, but we couldn't survive our politicians. And while state leaders boasted about diversifying tourism markets, the numbers didn't lie. Visitors from Brazil and Europe were rising slightly, but their economic footprint was a fraction of what Canadians once provided. Canadians stayed for 4 to 5 months. Most international tourists stayed a week. Canadians bought groceries, hired contractors, and integrated into local communities. Replacing them wasn't just unrealistic, it was mathematically impossible. Even Visit Florida's new CEO, Brian Griffin, admitted privately that the shift in spending patterns would take years to stabilize. But Florida doesn't have years. The damage is happening now. Beyond the economy, something deeper was changing. Florida's identity, once defined by openness and hospitality, was beginning to fracture. The state that sold itself as the Free State of Florida was now being seen abroad as restrictive, unpredictable, and politically hostile. For Canadians who had spent decades calling Florida their second home, the betrayal felt personal. "We used to feel welcome," said one retired couple from Toronto. "Now it feels like they don't want us here anymore." That sentiment spread quickly through Canadian media, sparking conversations about boycotts and calls to invest elsewhere. It wasn't just a loss of revenue, it was a loss of reputation. The ripple also hit Florida's service industries. Restaurants that once catered to predictable winter crowds suddenly faced erratic business cycles. Grocery stores cut seasonal staff. Local healthcare clinics, which had expanded capacity to serve seasonal residents, reported declines in patients. Even community clubs and volunteer organizations saw attendance drop as their Canadian members disappeared. These weren't just tourists. They were part of the social fabric, people who attended fundraisers, supported charities, and treated Florida as home. Without them, entire communities lost part of their heartbeat. By the end of 2025, it was clear the ripple was no longer a wave, it was a current pulling Florida's middle class under. State politicians still stood by their decisions, insisting that everything was fine. But the evidence was undeniable: empty restaurants, shuttered shops, declining tax bases, and residents quietly leaving for other states with stronger economies. Florida didn't just lose tourists. It lost its rhythm, its confidence, and its reputation as America's unstoppable paradise. The question now wasn't whether Florida could recover, it was whether it even understood what it had lost. What makes Florida's collapse even more dangerous is that it isn't just about lost tourists, it's about lost generations. For decades, the rhythm was predictable. Retirees from Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver would pack up every November and drive south to Naples, Fort Lauderdale, or Clearwater, spending the winter in the sunshine before heading home in the spring. These so-called snowbirds were the backbone of Florida's winter economy. They bought homes, paid property taxes, and became part of local communities. But that generation is aging out of travel, and the next generation isn't following in their footsteps. Younger Canadians don't dream about Florida the way their parents did. For them, the idea of owning a second home abroad feels outdated, expensive, and politically risky. Saddled with high housing costs, student debt, and a weaker Canadian dollar, many young Canadians see Florida not as a paradise, but as a headache. They're trading long stays for short, flexible, and cheaper vacations, and more importantly, they're choosing destinations that feel welcoming. The numbers show it clearly. In 2025, Canadian searches for Florida vacation homes dropped by 25%, while interest in properties across Mexico, Portugal, and Spain surged more than 40%. The shift is unmistakable. These countries not only offer warm weather, but also affordability, stability, and a friendlier attitude toward foreign visitors. And, unlike Florida, they're actively courting younger travelers with digital visa programs, long-term rental incentives, and inclusive messaging. In contrast, Florida's leadership seems stuck in a past era, proudly touting slogans like the Free State of Florida while ignoring the modern traveler's expectations of openness and respect. "My parents loved Florida," said a 33-year-old from Ottawa, "but for my generation, it's just too expensive and too political." That sentiment is spreading fast, and it's reshaping the entire future of Florida's economy. Real estate agents on the ground are already feeling the consequences. Karen O'Brien, who's helped Canadians buy property in Naples for nearly 20 years, says her younger clients aren't even considering Florida anymore. They'd rather buy in Lisbon or Cancun, she explained, because they feel wanted there. The pipeline of new buyers, the next wave of snowbirds, has dried up. Without them, Florida's long-term stability is at risk. Because tourism isn't just about the next season, it's about the next generation. The older snowbirds who once spent 5 months a year in Florida are slowly selling their homes or passing them down to children who don't want them. Those homes are sitting empty or being flipped into short-term rentals that bring less reliable income to local economies. Meanwhile, younger Canadians are reshaping what tourism looks like. They prefer experiences over ownership, movement over permanence. They're digital nomads, not retirees. They work remotely, travel light, and seek out destinations with a sense of cultural connection. Florida doesn't fit that model anymore. Instead of representing freedom, it's become a symbol of bureaucracy, rising costs, and political friction. Florida used to feel easy, said one former visitor. Now it just feels angry. That perception shift is devastating, because in tourism, perception is everything. This generational divide ensures that Florida's decline won't be temporary. Even if the state's leaders reverse their policies tomorrow, the emotional damage is done. The loyalty that took decades to build has been broken, and younger travelers have already found new homes for their winters. Florida didn't just lose a market, it lost a mindset. And when a destination loses its relevance to the next generation, its fall isn't a question of if, it's only a question of when. Florida's $37 billion disaster didn't come from a storm or an economic crash. It came from its own leaders. They promised freedom, prosperity, and fiscal discipline. But what they delivered was economic chaos and a self-inflicted wound that may take decades to heal. By eliminating the tourist development councils, mocking their most loyal visitors, and treating tourism as expendable, Florida's politicians destroyed the foundation that made the state thrive. $37 billion lost, $22.5 billion in wages erased, and millions of residents now wondering how the free state became trapped by its own arrogance. This wasn't just a policy failure, it was a betrayal of Florida's people. Because while politicians argued about ideology, workers lost their jobs, businesses closed their doors, and entire communities began to crumble. The tragedy is how easily it could have been avoided. Florida didn't need to choose between politics and prosperity. It could have protected its taxpayers and its tourism industry if only it had remembered that economic growth depends on trust, not slogans. But the state's leaders didn't listen. They ignored warnings from economists, business owners, and industry experts. They called critics alarmists, laughed at declining numbers, and dismissed a crisis unfolding in plain sight. Now, as empty hotel rooms and boarded-up storefronts stretch from Fort Lauderdale to Fort Myers, those same leaders insist everything is fine, but nothing about this is fine. Florida still has its sunshine, its beaches, and its world-class attractions. But tourism isn't about palm trees, it's about people. And people don't forget when they're made to feel unwelcome. Once loyalty breaks, it doesn't return easily. Other destinations, Mexico, Portugal, Spain, are already taking what Florida threw away, offering warmth, respect, and stability. The Sunshine State thought its success was permanent. It believed it could survive without the very people who built its prosperity. But now, it's learning the truth the hard way. When politics kills trust, even paradise can collapse.